Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Barbara Bodine, and I am the director of the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown University. I am pleased to be joined today by ISD Rusk Fellow and State Department Foreign Service Officer Becky Farmer. Through this forum, we engage leaders from diverse communities across the foreign affairs active world to discuss careers and their lives. This is part of the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy's broader mandate to connect students with foreign policy professionals to better understand the rewards and the challenges of these careers. This is brought to you in part by the Una Chapman Cox Foundation, their project on American diplomacy and the Foreign Service. Today, I am delighted to welcome Deputy Assistant Secretary Gabe Escobar. Mr. Escobar now serves in the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs as Deputy Assistant Secretary, overseeing policy towards the countries of the Western Balkans and the Office of Press and Public Diplomacy. Previously, he served as Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Belgrade, Serbia. Other leadership positions include Economic Minister Counselor at the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, Coordinator for Cuban Affairs in the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs, Deputy Chief of Mission in La Paz, Bolivia, Consul General in Peshawar, Pakistan, and team leader of a provincial reconstruction team in Kirkuk. As you can tell, he has had a very broad and varied career. From 1998 to 2001, he completed 4 consecutive, and I have confirmed that it was 4 consecutive one-year tours in the former Yugoslavia. He started as the Counselor for Political and Economic Affairs, 4 consecutive tours in the former Yugoslavia, culminating in Deputy Chief of Mission. He has also served in Lisbon, Rome, Prague, Moscow, and he is a graduate of Columbia University and Cathedral High School in El Paso, Texas. He speaks Spanish, Russian, Italian, Serbian, Croatian, Czech, and Portuguese, and is also known to be fluent in English. We are thrilled to have somebody with your background be able to join us today. I want to take you back to the beginning of your career and ask you what initially attracted you to foreign affairs. What steps, what processes led you to decide that this was going to be your career? And in other words, would you share with us your origin story?
Sure. Well, thank you for that introduction, Ambassador, and it's good to see you in person.
Yeah.
Ambassador Bodine and I have crossed paths many times, mostly virtually, but this is the first time I think we've ever met in person.
Mm-hmm.
But, well, let me start from the very beginning. I mean, I think I was attracted to the Foreign Service for the same reasons a lot of my colleagues are. I was born in a very small town in West Texas in a very modest family without many opportunities for travel or even having traveled very far outside of my hometown. And I was lucky enough to be able to go to school in New York. And it was there that I started to realize that there was a much bigger world, and that world was populated with people who spoke different languages and came from different backgrounds and were born in different countries. And all of that was so incredibly fascinating. And in the midst of that, that Columbia University education was interrupted many times, including by an enlistment in the U.S. Navy. But throughout that time, and including my time in the military, I really knew that I wanted some career that incorporated the ability to travel, the ability to get to know other cultures, the ability to learn languages, which I found fascinating, that there were people who were communicating entirely in ways that I would never be able to comprehend unless I learned their language. And as you can tell from all the languages that I really enjoyed learning, that was something that I took very seriously. And when you put all of that together, the most unique career path that somebody who has those aspirations can take is a career in diplomacy. And so I made it from a very early age my goal to join the Foreign Service. And I've been fortunate and privileged enough to have not only been selected to join the Foreign Service, but to be given opportunities to do some very exciting things in the Foreign Service.
Well, that's terrific. And I think a lot of our listeners today and on this interview at a later date will be very, very pleased to hear that you can come from small town West Texas and rise to the highest levels of the State Department and have as rich a career as you've had. I'm now going to turn the chair over to Becky Farmer, who is one of our two Dean and Virginia Rusk Fellows at the Institute this year. And Becky's most immediate position before joining us was as a member of the National Security Council working on the Middle East. So Becky, the chair is yours. And I will now become just a participant.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Ambassador Bodine, and good morning to all of the participants who have joined us today. Before we continue, I would like to ask the audience to start thinking about questions that you would like to pose for DAS Escobar when I finish our initial round of questions. We'll begin taking these Q&A in the Q&A box in just a few minutes. And when you add your question, please be sure to indicate both your name and your affiliation. With that said, let's continue. DAS Escobar, thank you so much for joining us today. I had the great fortune of serving in Baghdad with you several years ago, and I am delighted to have the opportunity to continue this conversation now. My first question is somewhat similar to Ambassador Bodine, but of course, all of our previous experiences individually, in our families, in our communities, shape ultimately our perspectives on the country and of course on this country's role in the world. How has your background and your identity shaped your approach to diplomacy?
Well, look, I'll start by saying that everybody's identity and everybody's personal story shapes their outlook in life and their approach to their careers and their work. But I would say that the one thing that I would say gave me an advantage in this job was that I was born bilingual. In fact, I didn't speak English almost until I was 5. And so the idea that you could reach out across cultures and across borders was something that was almost innate to people in my community. It's a fully bilingual trans-border community. The city of El Paso, Texas and Ciudad Juarez are closer geographically than Arlington and Washington. And so that capacity to be able to move between two nations, two cultures, two languages, was something that made it almost natural for me to join the Foreign Service and to feel comfortable in the context of living and working and speaking in different languages and living in other cultures. So I would say that was a huge advantage, and it continues to be an advantage, not just for me, but some of the diverse workforce that we recruit. We recruit people whose first languages are Chinese or Arabic, Spanish or German. And I don't think any other diplomatic service can boast that. That we can send diplomats, American diplomats, to countries all over the world and know that they're speaking their first language. That is truly amazing.
Absolutely. My next question is about your experience in the Foreign Service and whether you have ever experienced personally bias or discrimination, or whether you've seen that something experienced by your colleagues. And if so, how did you respond and how has that shaped your approach to diplomacy?
Well, look, I have to tell you that the Foreign Service is not immune to a lot of the trends and attitudes that have shaped America over the last few years. I would say that in some cases there was some bias and discrimination that was both open and institutional, not just against ethnic and racial minorities, but against women as well. And I'll give you a couple of examples because I used to do work with the Federal Women's Program at one of my posts. And the ambassador there had encouraged me to do some research on how the Foreign Service evolved in terms of its relationship to its women employees. And what the Foreign Service used to do is it actually used to exclude women from senior leadership positions. But right before I was bought into the service, if you were a woman and you got married, you were asked to resign from the Foreign Service. And then later, when they removed that, they were still placing women in career fields that were mostly administrative or consular, because the impression was among the top leadership that women couldn't handle the more academic fields and more traditional diplomatic fields of political and economic. And so for a very long time, almost all of our ambassadors were men. And so if you look at that, that was very structural, and that was actually in the regulations. Now, for ethnic minorities, there was a similar kind of bias. Luckily, by the time I came in, it wasn't as overt, but there was some. In fact, when I started in the Foreign Service, and I say this, that somebody recommended this to me without any sort of malice that I could detect, but that maybe I would be more comfortable working in the Latin American Bureau because of who I was and where I started from, and that somehow it would be more welcoming to me and I would feel more comfortable, even though I came into the service speaking Russian. And luckily, the personnel process led me to Russia, and which is why I spent most of my career in Europe. You know, had I done that career path, you know, it would have meant that I would have never used my European languages, that I would have missed out on an entire part of my career. I do think that that kind of unconscious bias has shaped a lot of people. And the other thing is that the recruitment, or I would say lack of recruitment, when I came in, the Foreign Service was really a service where people had to find out about the State Department on their own. They had to navigate the process on their own. And when they came in, they found that most of the people who were in the Foreign Service came from elite Eastern Atlantic Coast universities. And so we lacked a tremendous amount of diversity from both geographic, ethnic, and racial from the interior of the country. Now that the department does place a lot of emphasis on recruitment, we're seeing incredibly diverse classes. I would say that, you know, the group that I represent, you're looking at me, you're looking at the product of 30 years ago. And so a lot of my cohorts, a lot of my colleagues, some of us, and I include myself in that group, don't represent the full diversity of America. I think that there are fewer than 10 Latino senior Foreign Service officers of my grade. And I would say probably fewer Asian Americans. So, but if you look at the income classes, they're incredibly diverse. So I would say that, you know, the department has done a lot to identify its own biases and correct them.
Oh, I think that resonates quite a bit with me. Of my initial incoming class, which was over 10 years ago now, I think nearly half the class were immigrants to the United States and spoke English as a second language, which was both heartening and surprising to me. Yeah. On that same note, the State Department as an institution is, of course, I think, making great efforts to try to increase its diversity. I'm curious, have you seen progress in the department's efforts to recruit and also to retain diverse personnel? And in your opinion, what needs to happen to ensure that the State Department becomes more representative of the American people? And how does U.S. diplomacy more broadly benefit from having a diverse workforce?
Well, look, I'll start by saying, having been in the development process of some of these programs to develop diversity, the push is real. It's not cosmetic. We are looking for ways to find truly talented people. If we're talking about diversity, we're talking mostly not about choosing people based on, you know, who they are, but giving people opportunities to compete fairly. So in other words, we do interviews with the cameras turned off. In some cases, we do assessments without pronouns, without any identifying feature of who the person is, so that the person's interviews, that the person's qualifications come through without any sort of indication of who they are. And believe it or not, that has done far more to increase the diversity of the process at the senior levels than ever before. Now, on the incoming level and the recruitment levels, there's constantly an effort to adapt the Foreign Service to include more capacity for people to highlight their own personal skills, as opposed to a strictly academic skill or strictly the traditional type of Foreign Service exam that brought many of us in. So in that regard, we're looking for every kind of diversity. And by the way, it's not just diversity in the traditional sense, which is ethnic and racial and gender, but also diversity in education, diversity in geography, diversity in personal experiences. So in a way, what we're trying to do is we're trying to touch every demographic and every aspect of American life and bring that in to the Foreign Service, which is truly there to represent the country as a whole, not just segments of the country, but all of it. And I'm really proud of the progress that we've made over the last 10 years.
Absolutely. I'm curious, I have seen countless diplomats look to you as a role model
Thank you.
and as a mentor. I'm curious to hear more about how mentors have shaped your career and how have they informed your own approach to mentorship.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'll tell you, in the mentorship part, in every organization, in every stage of life development, if you're 20 years old, it's hard to know what's ahead of you. You can imagine, you look at somebody who is at the peak of their career and think, I would like to do that, but you don't know how to do it. And if you figure it out on your own, you're really groping around in the dark. So the mentors who can help you navigate every step, help you figure out how you can best approach every challenge to getting to your highest aspirations in your career, I think that's absolutely important. And not just for the Foreign Service, I think for anything. Whether it's, the first time I bought a house, I needed my father to help me navigate that because I didn't know the first thing about it. And, when I went to college, I needed my older brother to walk me through the application process. So I think that in every stage of life, you really need to look for mentors. And in the Foreign Service, it is indispensable because our selection process, our bidding process, our promotion process, and even the evaluation process, as much as we try to make them transparent to people on the other end, they don't know the inputs that go into the decision-making process. They don't know how the boards work. They don't know how the selection committees work. We can explain it, but in reality, it's that personal interaction where you can sit and you can pose questions directly and think out challenges. There's no substitute for that.
I couldn't agree more, certainly in my experience. I'm curious, shifting a bit more to your professional experience. As I mentioned before, we were fortunate to have served in Iraq together, which is, of course, an enormously diverse country.
Right.
I'm curious how you view our diversity as a foreign service, how it affects our work in countries as diverse as Iraq and, of course, many others around the world.
Well, I'll tell you, starting from the first, the diversity really is what really shatters the stereotypes of what America is. So all over the world, the vast majority of people in this world have never visited the United States. Many have never had contact with the United States. And so their image of the United States is actually formed through TV or movies or video games or music. And that is a very skewed picture of what America is, both for good and bad. And so when you walk into a room as an American diplomat, there are immediate preconceptions about what you represent and who you are. And in many countries, including countries that are very friendly to America, it is surprising to see someone who they weren't expecting walk into a room and competently and eloquently defend the interests of the United States. And I think that is a tremendous strength. I would say, if you're on the other side, it's incredibly intimidating to know that you're dealing with a service that can take people from any walk of life, any background, and make them powerful tools of diplomacy. So in that regard, I can't imagine now an alternative to the diverse workforce that we have.
In addition to your time in Iraq, and as we heard from Ambassador Bodine, of course, in your introduction, you've devoted a significant amount of time and energy and attention in your career towards the Balkans at various stages throughout their history. Could you tell us a bit more about your work there and about how your background and your previous experiences shaped your approach to complicated ethnic and other diverse landscapes like these?
Yeah, well, that is a really, really pertinent question. And I'll tell you, I served in the former Yugoslavia as it was breaking up. And what characterized that part of the world at the time was ethnic rivalry and eventually ethnic hatred. And I'm coming from a country that, despite our own internal challenges, is nothing like what I was seeing in the Balkans. In fact, in the United States, I would say we're characterized by openness and ethnic harmony. And going to a place like that where people felt that if they were a different, in fact, slightly different ethnicity or affiliated with a different religion, that they were at risk from the others. And so therefore they needed to be collectively controlled, collectively protected, that their politics had to be about protecting each other based on ethnic and religious preferences. And quite honestly, that doesn't work. And what we've tried to do, our policy in the Balkans, and the one that I've been very, very focused on, is creating opportunities for people to find commonality. Now, right now, politically it's difficult, but economically it's incredibly successful. And, to your question, like, how does my personal background support that? One of the things that we're trying to do in parts of Yugoslavia that broke up, where you have ethnic groups that were once living in a different country and now living in a new country. And I'll give you an example, Kosovo, that has a significant number of ethnic Serbs who were living in what was once Serbia, but is now Kosovo, where they were the majority community, Orthodox and Slavic speaking, and are now in a minority in a country that's predominantly Muslim and predominantly Albanian speaker. The government of Kosovo, which is supported by the United States, is looking for opportunities to create self-governance models and self-management models, and they're having trouble with it. It is a European approach to providing ethnic minorities the right to municipal services in their own language. Now, that's caused a tremendous amount of fear in the Albanian population, believing that the Serbs would misuse that self-management, that they would find a way to carve themselves out from the legal and constitutional structure in a way that would destroy the state from within. And my personal example is, I am the beneficiary of something like that. My mother votes in Spanish. She gets her Medicare in Spanish. She gets her driver's license in Spanish. She gets all of her public services in Spanish. And it doesn't threaten the constitutional or legal authority or legitimacy of the United States. In fact, in many parts of this country, including, I would say, in Arlington, I can leave the department and live my entire life in Spanish. And it doesn't affect the legitimacy or cohesion of the United States. And that's a lesson that I can see very clearly, a vision and an aspiration for those countries that I can see very clearly that they're struggling to figure out. So I would say that my experience, my personal upbringing, is uniquely suited for what's happening in the Balkans today.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. Well, before I hand over the questions to our audience, I do have one final question for you, which is for those in our audience who are interested in a career in diplomacy, whether they're students, whether they're in the early stages or the later stages of their professional career, from any variety of backgrounds, what advice would you have?
Well, first, if you're interested in diplomacy, pursue it, and pursue it aggressively. And the one thing that I always caution people is that the Foreign Service test is not pass-fail. It's select or not select. Some years we select 15%, some years we select 30% of the people who pass. But it's not a factor of we don't want you. It's a factor of we can't afford you at this particular moment. And so if you make it far enough in the process, you are likely going to make it at some point. It took me 3 times to get into the Foreign Service, and I'm glad I stuck through it. I know a really tremendous, one of the most impressive economic officers I know. He took it 6 times. So, you know, the primary characteristic that you need to be a Foreign Service officer is patience. So that's what I always tell people.
I could not agree with that more. I have heard many similar stories from our colleagues. So again, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, for sharing your insights. I'll now turn it over to questions from the audience. So our first question is from Veronica, and she is wondering how you can leverage your values when you disagree with the way that foreign policy is sometimes conducted.
Yeah, well, you know, I'll tell you, for the Foreign Service, I mean, when you think about foreign policy, I think people think about the broad strokes of what a policy is. But in reality, if you imagine our foreign affairs engagement in the world, sort of like an architect who designs a house, there are going to be many people who pick out the carpet, who pick out the colors, who pick out the light fixtures. And all of that comes together to create a beautiful result. And so we are such a small service that you are the policy. So if you are, for example, I was the political military officer in Prague at the age of 35. Nobody knew more about the procurement process for military modernization in the Czech Republic than I did at the time. And so when we were talking about whether the Czech Republic needs, for example, supersonics or whether it needed tanks, they were turning to me, because that had a huge impact on the way we were helping the Czech Republic finance its own modernization, which also, along with my colleagues, we were trying to figure out what role did the smaller NATO countries have in a larger defense. And so in a way, what's great about this career is you help build the policy. So you have an ownership stake in the policy. It's not as if you have people at the very top who tell you exactly what you're going to do all the way down to the detail. You're helping them figure out and navigate the world. Becky and I did that, I would say, quite effectively in Iraq, when we were talking about our outreach to some of the communities that had been on the adversarial side of the United States, with the Sunnis, the Sunni communities, who were starting to become more open to American partnership. So that was a policy that we were recommending. Now, there are times when there are huge issues that are beyond our control. And in cases like that, and I will say in my career, one of the most controversial policy decisions was the decision to go into Iraq. And we had a lot of people in the Foreign Service who were adamantly opposed to it. There were a lot of people who were in favor of it. And but what overwhelmingly we were given the opportunity to do is take whatever policy decision was made at the very top and make it better in terms of how do we engage with communities, how do we deal with the institutions, how do we bring in allies and neighbors and regional powers into the process to make that as much of a success as we could after the decision had been made. So there's a lot of opportunities to shape a policy, whether you like it or don't like it. And then finally, if you really disagree, the State Department has something called the dissent channel, where anybody at any level can disagree with policy and write a cable directly to the Secretary, making recommendations on policy or explaining why the policy that has been chosen isn't working. And not only can people do that, but we actually have a reward for it. And those people are free from retaliation from anybody who they dissent against. And in many cases, they're celebrated in the service. I would say it's a very powerful tool. It doesn't mean that one person has a veto on our policy, but anyone who has a very strong opinion on a policy has an opportunity to communicate it directly to the Secretary if necessary.
Our next question is from Yajat Gupta, who's a freshman at Georgetown in the School of Foreign Service. It says, thank you for taking the time to be here with us. And his question is, in your opinion, what does growth within the Foreign Service look like? And how much control over it do you have?
Well, I'll tell you, when you start out, and I had a lot of colleagues like this, you start looking at the Foreign Service as a career path that's linear. That is, I would say almost overwhelmingly the first question anybody has when they come in is, how do you become an ambassador? And that is a pretty impressive aspiration, and one that a lot of people in the Foreign Service do achieve. However, in the course of joining the Foreign Service and living a career, there are people who decide that they want something different out of the service. I'll give you an example. One of my colleagues, in his first tour, he went to Poland, married a woman from Poland, and his career aspirations dramatically changed when he had children. And he wanted those children to be able to experience a very strong and nurturing relationship with their Polish grandparents. So he continually went back to Poland and served there, even though he was taking what we would call career cul-de-sacs that wasn't helping him develop at least the skills that he needed to move further, at least rank-wise in the Foreign Service. And he retired and he bought a house in Poland and he travels between the two countries. For him, that was his personal path, and it was a valid one. And there are other people who decide what they want to do with the Foreign Service based on family, based on what they decide that works for them. But yeah, there are still a lot of people who do want to climb the career path, the career ladder. And I would say that for every one of those, you can find a mentor and you can find support for it within the Foreign Service. We strive to be family friendly. We strive to be nurturing. We strive to mentoring to those who want to climb the career ladder. We don't always meet our own aspirations, but there's enough in a service that has 200 overseas missions in every continent of the world to be able to find something that makes you happy.
Thank you. Our next question relates to your comments about sometimes the challenges in being selected for the Foreign Service or the patience that it requires. So our question is, how can one best be prepared with backup options if they aren't selected for the Foreign Service? Are there perhaps other professional opportunities where they could make a difference?
Yeah. Well, look, I would say Foreign Affairs is more than just the State Department, and the State Department is more than just the Foreign Service. So I would say, if you're truly interested in the Foreign Service, the best preparation is to take the Foreign Service exam, recognizing that you may have to take it more than once. And I think that was my path. I mean, there was nothing, there was no study guides when I was taking it. There was no classes, and I didn't know anybody who was in the Foreign Service, so I couldn't ask for mentorship. It was just trial and error. But in Foreign Affairs, there are many, many paths. So we have other agencies that do send people overseas. We have military colleagues who do some of the similar things that we do. The State Department has a very diverse and very dynamic civil service, people who are true experts in their fields, whether it's development or arms control or something similar, where you really need deep expertise. Foreign Service officers, we consider ourselves generalists. That means we're able to travel and learn about a country and then defend American interests. Well, it doesn't make us experts at all. And you also have development agencies, the USAID and others. And beyond that, there is a slew of people who work with us as partners, including NGOs and civil society and some really amazing organizations that you'll find overseas that are really making a difference. So, and in fact, there's a lot of cross-fertilization among all of that ecosystem of foreign affairs practitioners.
Our next question goes back to your initial comments about how when you first joined the Foreign Service, there were some who were steering your career in the direction of Latin America. And our question is, essentially, you have served some of your time in Latin America, but you've also served throughout the world, in the Middle East, in Europe, and so on. Do you find that your background has affected the way that you have approached diplomacy in Latin America or elsewhere, or has in any way shaped your approach?
Well, that's a really good question. And it's hard for me to be objective about myself in this regard. I would say that my fear of going to Latin America the first time was that I wouldn't be taken seriously as a quote unquote true American. that I would be taken more as, a member of that community. And I have to say, it didn't happen. Being an American with a diplomatic passport, working at the embassy, people understood who I was and what I represented. And I know that there are colleagues I've worked with colleagues in South Asia when I was in Pakistan, who were, either Indian American or Pakistani American, who had the same concerns, and it didn't materialize. So I would say that, being an American diplomat, you are an American diplomat, and people understand that. So I would say that it didn't really affect my approach, but it did occasionally, because my level of fluency was much, much higher than some of the colleagues who had just recently graduated from the language program. It did give me a slight bit edge in access and understanding some of the cultural and historical nuances, but not much more. I would say, my colleagues who had studied Spanish before versus the ones who were native speakers didn't differ that much. We were all pretty well supported by the embassy. I will tell you, internally though, when I went to Latin America early on, there were so few Latinos in the State Department that people in the embassy sometimes mistook me for another agency. So people would think that maybe I worked for Customs or DEA, because they couldn't imagine, even internally with the State Department, that there was a Latino political officer working in the embassy. And for a while, even in the European Bureau, I think there was 2 Latinos worked in the 90s in all of the European Bureau. So that had been an internal challenge. Externally, I didn't face as much of a challenge as I thought I would.
Interesting. Our next question goes back to your comments in your previous answer about the wide variety of foreign affairs careers that are available. The question is sort of a two-parter. First, are there ways in which you have seen other government agencies more effectively recruit a diverse workforce, or are there lessons learned for the State Department that you think we could borrow? And then also, how do you think the diversity or lack of diversity in other government institutions affects our presence and their operations overseas?
Well, look, I'm really proud of all the progress the State Department's made. But I would say on the diversity front, we're late to the game. So I went to a university that prided itself on being diverse, and it really was kind of diverse. But Columbia University was not very diverse economically, and that had a real impact on the outlook that the students had. And shortly after that, I enlisted in the military, which was truly a diverse organization. You had people coming from all walks of life without regard to money or without regard to background. And that was where I realized that that was possible. And so the military, I would say, is by far started out, especially at the lower ranks, especially in the enlisted ranks, extremely diverse. And even now the officer corps is extremely diverse. They were really good. I spent a while working in the Department of Justice and worked very closely with the FBI. Law enforcement was extremely diverse. And a lot of agencies in Washington were extremely diverse. So at a certain point, the Foreign Service had to start thinking about what was it that was our obstacle to diversity. And there were 2 things. One is people didn't know about us. We didn't recruit. I thought, when I started researching it, that to be a diplomat, you had to be connected. You had to be a political donor. You had to be a Kennedy. The idea that a poor kid from West Texas could become a diplomat and represent his country overseas never occurred to me early on until I started doing research on foreign affairs careers. So that's one, is we haven't spread the word very much. And 2, there was something intrinsic about the Foreign Service exam that was weeding out diversity. And so that's what we have been focused on, is how do we create an entry process that welcomes everybody and that's fair to everyone and that evens the playing field for everyone. And I have to say that looking at the classes now, we're getting more successful at it. We're getting really successful.
Well, I think we are unfortunately nearing the end of our time with you, but I do want to thank you again for having this fascinating conversation with us today. And I want to give you the opportunity to give any final thoughts, any words of wisdom again for those who may be interested in a career in the Foreign Service or diplomacy more broadly. That anything else you may want to share with the audience.
Well, all I can say is this is a fascinating and enriching career. And it says something that you have people who have been through a 30-year career and still want to be engaged. People like Ambassador Bodine and countless other ambassadors and mentors that I've had, that they want to continue to contribute to the Foreign Service. It means something. And it truly is a welcoming organization. It truly is a fascinating career. And so I do encourage people who have an interest in other cultures and languages and travel to think about the Foreign Service as a career. And, you know, we really truly are interested in only two things, is recruiting American citizens with a desire to serve their country under various conditions. And I think that's it. Those are our only two requirements. You know, all of the rest of it is beneficial, including the educational part and the experience part, but it's not necessary. So we have people who come in with just a 4-year degree. We have people who come in with no work experience, no relevant work experience in the Foreign Service, and they still go on to become really impressive officers. So I would say, pursue it, be patient, don't give up, and know that it'll be challenging. But, you know, those of you who are affiliated with this university, you have a range of mentors, which is a huge advantage as well. And lastly, I do want to thank the university, Ambassador Bodine, and you, Becky, for the opportunity.
Wonderful. Well, again, thank you very much for being here with us today.